But so I have some bad news first and then some good news second from our report that we just released in January. The bad news is we only have 75 members of our supply chain program engaging their suppliers. They have about $2 trillion in spend, but it's really just scratching the surface. These 75 members include 72 corporations, 2 NGOs, and 1 government agency. Thank you to the GSA for being our current federal agency in the program. They collectively went out to about 8,000 suppliers around the world to request disclosure, and we helped them facilitate all of that information flow over the past year. So I said I'd have some bad news. Only 51% of the suppliers actually responded. So while we can do a lot of analysis on that data, 49% of the suppliers either had something to hide or just ignored the request or didn't take it seriously or for whatever reason didn't report. And they're actually the biggest risk because they're the big empty black hole in the data set, and you have no way of knowing how resilient they'll be, how efficient they are, and if they're just starting this journey now, they probably have a lot of catching up to do. So they're the biggest risk and therefore opportunity in my perspective. Of the 4,005 suppliers who actually responded to us, it's the largest data set of this kind anywhere, so it's a quite sizable piece of data. 72% of them were able to identify some type of risk from climate. There was a question about risk. So that's regulatory risk, physical extreme weather event risk, or reputational or market-based risk. And that's actually a good thing. When companies can recognize the risk, then they know how to mitigate it, or they can begin to put plans in place to mitigate the risk. And so we see that as actually a positive. Interestingly, 64% of those risks were regulatory risk, which we think is really interesting with China announcing cap and trade coming online next year, that a lot of companies are increasingly reporting anticipated regulatory risk as a major driver of their climate actions. Only 2/3 were actually able to report a greenhouse gas footprint of some sort to the Carbon Disclosure Project, and only 1/3 actually reported an overall reduction of their footprint in the past year. So there's still a lot of work to be done. Even those companies that know what their footprint is aren't always able to fully manage it. But the good news, CDP was founded on this idea of what gets measured gets managed, right? That's our sort of premise that we operate under in all aspects, and what gets reported gets reduced. And finally, we actually did the numbers and we proved that disclosure does work. So just some stats on that. So for companies responding for their first year, about 28% were able to set a target to reduce emissions. By their second year of disclosure, 43% are reporting a target. And by their third year, 56% of those companies have a target. So we're getting there. On the emissions reduction side, it's also good news. So 38% are first-time responders, but by their third year, 69% of them are actually reporting emissions reductions. So in just 3 years, we start to see companies measure and then begin to really manage their emissions. And on the risk side, it's the same thing. 43% in the first year are reporting risks, but it's up to 71% by year 3. So we really see that companies do start to move along that journey. And the other really good piece of news is that procurement mechanisms do work. So we did some analysis looking at those suppliers that actually reduced their emissions, and we correlated it back to which customers had made a request of that customer. And we found that the 3 biggest drivers of suppliers taking action work for anyone making any purchase around the world. So public supply chain engagement targets really drive supplier action. Those companies and governments that set big, ambitious goals and publicly announce what they expect of their suppliers, we really do see that action happen on the supply front. Engaging buyers in the ask was another highly correlated data point. So when this is run out of a sustainability team, it really doesn't drive that much action. Once the buyer engages the supplier directly, includes it in traditional business decision opportunities, that's when we really see action on the supplier front. And finally, to that point, embedding this type of data into specific procurement asks, into contract language, into RFP language, into code of conduct language, really drives the action, because then it's being institutionalized, it's part of business as usual, and we have the data to prove that those trigger points actually do trigger action on the supplier front. So we're very heartened to see that. It's not all about price. You don't always have to pay the supplier more. You can actually use a variety of other traditional procurement mechanisms to trigger the expectations and the needs, and then to follow up and ensure that there is compliance on the back end. So I'll save the rest of my remarks for the rest, but that's my perspective, is it's working. There's good news out there. Disclosure works.